Hi, this is George Fox Talks. I'm Jay Miller, and today I'm joined by Melanie Mock to talk about parenting and relating to the young adults in our lives. I'm Jay Miller, and today I'm joined by Melanie Mock. Melanie is a professor of English in the Language and Literature Department. So I'm fortunate to have her as a colleague, and I was also fortunate to have her as a student back when I was a student. So it's exciting for me to talk to Melanie about her work today. Her new book is Finding Our Way Forward: When the Children We Love Become Adults. And this was just published this year, right, Melanie? 2023?
Yeah, March 2023.
March 2023 with Herald Press. Finding Our Way Forward: When the Children We Love Become Adults. You're very explicit, Melanie, in the introduction that this isn't a how-to book for like how to parent your young adult children, etc. And I think that's a great insight because this book does so many different things. It's one of the things I really enjoyed about it. That as I was reading, I was noticing, oh, we're slipping into memoir here, or we're doing cultural criticism. You also have reportage from some of the students and the kind of young adults in your life that you're kind of reporting on what their experiences are. And I was really struck by that mix of genres, and there are probably others in there, and was curious if you could say a little bit about how the book came together in terms of the genres you chose to work with, if that was an intentional kind of blending of different genres, or if it just kind of came together slowly and you realized you had these separate strands of the book that you're using to talk about how adults can relate to young adults.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I made it very clear with the publisher that I am not an expert on young adults and parenting because I'm still in the journey right now with my two youngest sons. So I was very explicit that I could not write a how-to book. A lot of Christian women's writing right now especially has that mix of memoir and cultural critique. And so I'm just following along in that trend of using my own personal story as a way to explore larger ideas, a very prominent trend. The way the book came together is Herald Press contacted me and asked me if I had any ideas, which is something that doesn't happen a lot. But I write in Mennonite circles, and Herald Press has been a Mennonite publisher. And at the time when they approached me, my son Benjamin was in boot camp for the Navy. And so I'd been thinking a lot about his journey in boot camp since my husband and I are very ardent pacifists. And the challenge of trying to nurture my son into a different pathway other than the military was foremost in my mind. So I pitched this idea of writing about that experience to Herald Press. And that became then the book proposal that became the book. So the book does not explicitly say this is how to raise a child or mentor a young adult, but it uses my experiences as a parent and also as a teacher of young adults for 25 years now to explore the challenges that come with raising this generation and what we can learn about ourselves in the process.
And what year was that the press reached out to you then?
2020, late 2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there was other stuff going on in the world at that time.
Right. Yeah.
As you talk out, I mean, so you talked about the kind of personal challenges you were walking through, but from early on in the book, you also foreground just a lot of other stuff going on, in 2020 and 2021 being a really intense time.
Absolutely. So both my children graduated from high school in 2020, which meant they didn't graduate. They didn't have a graduation other than a drive-through thing. They didn't get to go through all the rituals that you go through your high school senior year. They were facing that fall of 2020. Newberg, Oregon was facing all kinds of forest fires and smoke and those kind of things. The pandemic was ongoing. It just felt like we were in crisis, that the world was on fire. And 2020 was also a time when there was racial unrest and political unrest. And so my kids and many other kids in this generation were trying to launch into adulthood with all these other stressors happening in their life at the same time.
So as you were kind of thinking, kind of in this real crucible, kind of writing your way through all these challenging experiences, what did you feel like? Yeah, it's not a how-to book, but I think there are a lot of really great insights for people out of your own experience in this book. And it was interesting for me to read. I'm a parent of a toddler and a newborn right now, so it's a very different stage. So it's interesting for me to read the book kind of looking ahead, and a lot of it made sense to me in terms of how kind of the parenting relationship could unfold. But what would you say if you had one or two kind of key takeaways for you that you learned as you were writing this book or articulate as you were writing this book? What would you say those are?
Oh, that's another great question. I think learning is a great way to put it, because the process of writing this book was a process of me learning about myself, learning about the world, learning about young people, and recognizing that if I am going to parent or mentor young adults well, I have to be open to learning as well. I think it's easy for somebody my age to get really entrenched in the way things are and the way things should be. But recognizing that as my kids are going through this transitional time and facing all these challenges, I am too, and that there aren't really that many guidebooks for how you launch an adult child during a pandemic. So I have to be open to learning. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is that I think Scripture already tells us, provides a roadmap for what we should do. And if we distill it down to a simple message, God tells us that we're supposed to love God and love others. And if we can approach parenting or mentoring young people through that lens, I think we both can make that transition more smoothly. And I also framed the book around Micah 6:8, which says, "What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, love mercy, and walk with humility." And so I tried to think about my life and my journey with my children through those frames of, what do I need to learn about humility? What do I need to learn about mercy? What do I need to learn about justice? And what can young people teach me about those things?
So I wonder if we could dive into a specific kind of example of that. You already brought up your son Ben joining the Navy after, kind of years of you and your husband kind of talking about your own pacifism and deep commitment in your writing and your lives and what you do to peace. And so just that setup, I think, can be very clear to people of what a difficult thing that would be. I understand that too, as someone committed to peace and, being against war and this sort of thing as a Quaker. So could you talk a little bit more about how you learned to apply Micah 6:8 to that parenting situation, or even just that relationship to your adult child?
Absolutely. So Benjamin, he actually came to George Fox for a year.
Okay.
Realized pretty early on that he didn't want to be at school. And April of his freshman year, approached Ron and I and told us that he was enlisting in the military. And we spent several months then pretty much begging him not to do that. We had really intense, deep conversations where Ron and I were crying because we can't imagine our son going into the military. But he was 18 and could make his own choices and made the choice to enlist and left for boot camp that fall. And that experience journeying with Ben taught me a good deal about humility in the sense that I felt like I knew exactly what my son's calling would be, and it wasn't in the military. And he was telling me that God was calling him to the military. He had processed this with trusted adults in his life and said, yes, this is the call that I'm supposed to make. And it was humbling to recognize that I spent my vocation talking with young people about calling and telling them to trust their calling. And here was my son telling me that he felt called to the military, and I was not trusting him. I wasn't trusting God. So there was humility in releasing him to that and releasing my own pride about that. And there was also pride in the sense that I felt like, and I'm just going to be really honest here, I felt like as a pacifist, my way was better than people who go into the military. I don't understand people who go in the military. I think it was wrong. I thought it was wrong. I didn't understand the patrioticness of the military. And I was humbling when Ben went into boot camp, and I started meeting other families whose children were in the military and recognizing my own bigotry about people in the military and families in the military, and recognizing that I needed to have a change of heart because these people were so lovely to me and to Ron and to Benjamin. They were so supportive, and I just needed to understand people better and have more empathy for where people are coming from. So that was a really humbling experience for me, and it continues to be a humbling experience for me.
Yeah, I think I wonder. You've talked about kind of the lessons for like parenting and relationship, but I wonder if we could digress a little bit and talk about just like what in there you're learning about like embodied or like living out one's pacifism, what that actually looks like concretely. And I wonder if for you, like in this experience, I don't know if we would put it as strongly as thinking about, usually when we talk about loving our enemies from a kind of past perspective, sometimes we're thinking about enemies outside of the United States, right? Or like countries or populations that the United States is sort of at war with or against. But I kind of hear you talking about learning to love enemies or people you strongly disagreed with or thought you were better than, in the United States or in the kind of own United States military. Am I kind of parsing that out correctly? And that's
absolutely.
Kind of, yeah. What do you think? Yeah. Could you just say more about how people with a pacifist perspective can take those kind of lessons on board more? Or why that's important?
Yeah. Well, I think there is a hubris in believing that the peace tradition is somehow more enlightened, more, well, I do think it's biblical, but the way we live that out really is important in our own communities and how we respond to other people. I think it's been really easy in my life here in Newburgh to like wear that pacifism as a mantle and therefore not want to even interact with somebody who has American flags all over their yard. Because I grew up Mennonite and learned, if only through osmosis, that those patriotic displays are anathema to what Jesus calls us to. But being able to let that go and have a conversation with somebody who has their home festooned in flags really challenges me to love somebody who's different than me and to have empathy for somebody who had a completely different upbringing than I did as a Mennonite.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit, in this kind of about your experience of learning kind of how to relate to young adults through your family. Another big part of this book is talking about what you've learned from your students. So you and I just, as college professors, I feel like it's just this is amazing opportunity and privilege to work with people. We work with non-traditional students as well, but primarily we're working with undergraduates who, turn 18, go to college, or at this really kind of pivotal time in their lives. And I think it's such a rich opportunity and a privilege. And you really draw on that in your book. And I'm curious, what do you feel like are some of the things, there are quite a lot, but I'm just kind of wondering what comes to mind when you think of what you've learned from your students over the years in terms of relating to people transitioning into young adulthood from being a teenager and being at home.
Yeah. So I think as my kids grew older, as they got to the age of college students, I learned a lot more about empathy and having empathy for where students are. There would have been a time where I was kind of irritated if a student was struggling and didn't come to class, and I would assume it was my problem, that I had done something I wasn't encouraging enough, or I wasn't inspiring enough to get them to come to class. But seeing my own children and some of the challenges they faced as they reached this age has made me far more empathetic for young people and the challenges that they're facing right now and the ways they're trying to navigate adulthood. I think I have a clear sense that becoming an adult is really, really difficult. And we nurture these people for 18 years, and then they're kind of on their own to try to figure things out. And so I'm learning even in my students how difficult and challenging being a young adult can be, and how much they need our support and encouragement as they develop their own lives, their own agency. I think I've learned a good deal about loving mercy from my students, and I give the example in the text of having a curriculum in my journalism class and not seeing any problem with it. I try to be really careful about being unbiased in the kinds of curricular choices I make. And a student coming to my office after class once and talking to me about how she was personally offended by something that I had the students read, that she felt it was really biased. And I appreciated so much her courage in being willing to do that and have that conversation. And then recognizing that I still have places where I can learn and grow, that I still have biases that I don't even see. And so being able to ask her for forgiveness was really empowering for both of us, I think, in that situation. So I've learned about loving mercy. I've learned about empathy. I've learned about creativity. I have a creative nonfiction class, and every semester just blows me away how creative students are. And even today, this afternoon, we did an exercise, and I was just like stunned by how creative and funny and sarcastic my students can be in all the best ways.
What do you think are, as I'm thinking about, all the young adults bring to the table, especially you talk a lot about Gen Z in this book as kind of in that young adult window right now. I'm a millennial. I'm kind of really aging out of young adulthood. It can be an oddly elastic category sometimes. It's kind of funny sometimes to get older and feel like people are still counting you as a young adult, but I think I'm finally kind of getting out of that phase. But what do you think are some of the stereotypes that you feel like your students or like Gen Z students in particular are fighting back against as young adults, and that you feel like your students maybe need to be given more agency is a word you use. You also use the word trust. But what are they up against just in terms of the way they're sometimes perceived by people who aren't their age?
Yeah, so I think Gen Z is seen as self-absorbed. I think they're seen as completely tied to technology and unwilling to be untethered by technology. I think they're seen as people who want to be coddled. I mean, that's the title of an essay about this generation. Yeah. So, and I think those are really unfair assessments of our young people. I think they long to be untethered from their technology. They recognize the problem that being tied to their phones, the problems that has created for them. And I've received so many essays from students who just express this longing to not be so tied to their phones and to social media and to the problems that engenders. Again, I see in this generation so much empathy for others, so much a longing to create equity and justice across ethnicities, across gender, sexuality, and that kind of tolerance, I think, does come out of social media. Their connectedness to other parts of the world helps them understand and see others better. And even though there are all kinds of limitations with technology, I think that's one of the good things, that it has made them more longing for justice, more tolerant for others, more empathetic about others. And sometimes I don't understand the judgment that they want to be coddled. I think if that is a problem, if they do want to be coddled, that falls on us, their parents and mentors who have created the kind of systems that allow them to ask us for more than we want to give them. So I'm thinking, for example, when I was a kid, if I didn't turn in my homework, my parents didn't know. if I got an F on a test, my parents didn't know. But now, I mean, we have immediate access to whether they've done their homework or not.
At the high school level.
At the high school, yeah. College level too. And, well, yeah, at the high school level, whether they've done their homework, what kind of grade they're getting. Like, we have access to all that and can just completely ride them and apply pressure to them consistently.
Yeah, and that's a use of technology, of an older generation using technology in a kind of surveilling way.
Right.
So you see the abuses of technology across the generations in that kind of example.
Right. And surveilling, there are apps that allow us to see exactly where our kids are at what time.
Right.
And I think that's created problems for our young people.
What do you think, kind of digging into that a little bit deeper, thinking about either judgments on Gen Z or in the ways that can go the other direction too? I think about the kind of the okay boomer kind of attitude that millennials and younger generations can sometimes have toward older generations. What do you think is at the source of generational resentment like that?
Yeah. Whew. That's a great question.
Yeah, that's obviously a big question, but I guess kind of growing out of your own, as you wrestled as a parent, kind of thinking through how do I navigate this?
Yeah.
You talk too about other parents, the community of parenting you're a part of.
Right.
Why do you think we sometimes turn toward resenting, younger generations, but really all generations in a way?
Yeah.
Why do we turn toward that resentment instead of compassion or understanding?
Right. Well, this is going to sound like an English professor answer, but I don't.
We're not reading enough novels.
Well, almost.
Or memoirs.
Yes. But also not listening to each other's stories. We don't take the time to get to know, truly get to know somebody, to know their story, to know their challenges, to know what their journey has been about. We don't just sit down and talk to people and get to know their stories. And I think when we know somebody else's story well, we're going to understand and appreciate them differently. In the book, in the last chapter, I talk about going on juniors abroad, which I've done 2 years in a row now, to Costa Rica. And that was an amazing intergenerational time where we sat down at dinner with these young people and got to know who they were outside of the classroom.
And just to jump in, people who may not know Juniors Abroad, it's a program we have here at George Fox. It's a great program where students study abroad for a month or a little less now in the month of May with faculty doing the kind of experiences you're talking about. So sorry to jump in. I just wanted to clarify for listeners.
No, that's great. So I've gone to Costa Rica 2 years now with students, and my co-leader is a good friend who works in the math department, and we've been friends for 35 years. So it makes, we went to college together. Yeah. So it allows them to see a friendship and a partnership and the authenticity of our friendship over all these years. It allows us to just sit down and get to know these students and their, who they are truly outside the classroom. And they see us grappling with our fears, grappling with challenges. I talk about having to jump off, do zip lining. I'm really afraid of heights. But having students watch me do that and seeing my humanness, I think changes our relationship with them, and they can see adults for who we really are. Mm-hmm.
So you did jump, because that chapter where you talk about it's a bit of a, it's not a cliffhanger, it's like a platform hanger. Yeah, I have to read it just because it was fun. So you're scared on the platform, and they give the Costa Rican affirmation that all is well and all be well. And that this life is worth living. He opened the platform gate, inviting me to leave. And that's where the chapter ends. Yeah. So I kind of was like, she leapt, right? As I was reading that. Did. So you did. How did it feel when you went down that zip line?
It was horrible. I felt really good that I had done it, and I don't want to ever have to do it again.
Yeah.
But more broadly, that's a metaphor for the invitation that we have to just leap into things, to lean into our relationship with young people, even when it feels scary or when there feels like there's that generational divide there. Just leaping into those opportunities. I think will be rewarding.
One of the things we really ask students to lean into during the college years, especially in a kind of Christian higher ed context, is the idea of vocation and kind of identifying and kind of following through on a calling. And one of your early, and I think one of the chapters that really stood out to me was the way you thought through vocation, young adulthood, and both the promise of that, but also maybe some of the pathologies of how we talk about vocation in our kind of Christian higher ed context. So could you talk a little bit about maybe what you think the standard narrative or one of the standard narratives of vocation is for students, maybe how that narrative can fall short sometimes, and what's a healthy, constructive way to talk about vocation with the young adults in our lives?
Yeah. So that's another observation that came out of trying to help my sons figure out what they were going to do after college graduation or high school graduation. And one of my sons saying to me, how do I know? I haven't been in the world yet. I don't know what the choices are. And that called me up short. Like, yes, we are asking our 18-year-olds to make decisions about vocation and calling, and they really don't know what's available to them. They don't know what kind of world exists beyond our home. And then I talked to for the book, I interviewed a number of George Fox graduates who talked about that same kind of pressure when they were seniors here at George Fox, and people saying, well, what's God calling you to? And a number of them saying, well, I'm not sure yet. And one of the students said it felt like that idea of calling or vocation was being weaponized. And if you did not know what your calling was, if you still weren't sure, then there was something wrong with you, rather than something wrong with this idea about vocation or calling. Because I think we can press students like early on at George Fox to pick a major, stick with that major, have a sense of your entire trajectory before you leave college, which is another great argument for the liberal arts, like allowing students the opportunity to explore the different opportunities that are open to them might be a better path forward, rather than saying you have to decide now what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And in the book, I use my own story of assuming that I was going to be a sports journalist all the way through college till my last semester, and then that things fell apart. I realized that was not what I was called to do. And then spending most of my 20s just completely anxious about what my calling was supposed to be, and wishing somebody had said to me at 21, just relax. You will find what God is calling you to, and do some exploration still, even after college graduation. So when I meet with students now who are getting ready to graduate, I make sure to have that talk with them, because I wish somebody had said that to me, that there's still time. You will find your calling, and you may have multiple callings in your life. Like, we are not just all called to one job or one vocation, and that God is actually calling us to something to a different kind of lived experience, where we love God and love others.
You bring up the really classic Frederick Buechner quote that I think a lot of people think of when they think about vocation, about vocation being where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet.
Right.
I'm wondering how you would unpack that for a student, the kind of two-pronged approach Buechner takes to vocation. Because I think with Buechner too, like, especially like, that's a quote I've heard so much. It's kind of one of those quotes where it's kind of a little bit like water going over my head or something, or under the bridge. I've kind of lost some of the pop that quote's supposed to have. So, and I think you did a nice job in the book kind of unpacking that. So how do you think about that as a way of helping students into this kind of more holistic understanding of what vocation can be?
Yeah. Well, I think like you, that quote has become kind of, it isn't as salient to me. And I honestly worry that sometimes it's a little bit classist, and, some people are going to have a job for the rest of their lives that they don't really enjoy, but they still do because they want to put food on the table for their family. So is there space in our calling to recognize that some people are going to have a job and then their calling is going to be apart from their job. And how can we honor those people who are doing different kinds of jobs and recognize that for some people the vocational calling might be completely different. I do hope that my students find joy in whatever they do, but also recognize that, not everybody's going to write the great American novel, and a lot of people who go through the English major are going to end up doing really. They may be writing for a number of years in ways that don't give them a lot of joy, but is still doing good in some ways for the world in which they exist.
One of my favorite kind of writings on vocation is by a scholar named Belden Lane, and he has a book in his, or an essay in his book called The Souls of Fierce Landscapes. The essay is called Stalking the Snow Leopard, a meditation on work. And in it, he makes a distinction between one's work and one's job. And the sense of like work is what is sort of deeply attached to our own gifting. And a job is kind of what in some ways gives us cover to do that work. Because there's always going to be this gap between your work, what you're doing out of your gifting and what you feel led to do, and like what a job requires of you. A job's always going to have aspects that are drudgery or not your favorite part, but hopefully your job is a cover. It gives you enough of a chance to do what you love to do. And I think maybe helping students understand that like there is that gap between their vocational work and then whatever job they find themselves in, and there can be different degrees of overlap. Some of us are really fortunate to find like a very tight overlap. There's never a complete overlap. And some, like you're saying, may have to kind of find other ways to express their vocation. You had a really great story in here about a student who ends up going to beauty school that you had. Can you tell that story? I thought that was just a perfect encapsulation of some of the stuff you were talking about.
Oh, for sure. So for a number of years, George Fox had a general ed course for first-year students where we would explore vocation and calling and what God was calling them to. And we had readings about that. They would do writing exploration. And the class really was for retention, to try to keep students at George Fox and invested. But one student, like 2.5 months into her first semester, was like, yeah, I think I'm called to go to beauty school and not be here at George Fox. So she left the university and went and pursued beauty school. Now, in some ways, that means the course failed. It didn't meet the objective of keeping that student at George Fox. But in other ways, like those readings really provide fertile ground for her to recognize that God was calling her to something that she didn't need to be at George Fox to do.
Yeah. And I love to, like, going back to that point you made of like the liberal arts context for that, right? You're in this kind of general education. I don't know what these readings were like, but I assume it kind of gave a broad sense for looking at that and the way that can help people discern vocation by helping them stand back from the super, not that there's anything wrong with something that's super vocationally oriented, that too, but especially when we're doing that discernment as young adults in a challenging job market, the ability to step back and reflect is just a really valuable thing that I think a liberal arts or just a humanistic kind of, or Christian, however you want to frame it, kind of education can provide.
Yeah.
I think if there was a big tension that you talk about in the book that we often have to work through and that you kind of felt yourself working through, is that tension between loving people, which we all know we're supposed to do, and we all know bears good fruit, even if it's hard, and like choosing to be fearful instead. And for me, that really came up in a moment sort of near the end of the book. I think in your chapter on love, you talked about a moment where you're out in the backyard doing what you call wood cutting therapy with a chainsaw, which I thought was a really powerful image. But I was wondering, could you tell that story as well, and what you learned from that moment?
Sure. So this was the summer of 2021, and both my kids were living at home. They had launched for a little while, and then they came back home. Benjamin was deciding to go to enlist, and my younger son was having trouble like gaining traction on adulthood. And I was just feeling lots of stress and anxiety and fear about their futures because it didn't seem clear to any of us. So I was cutting wood in the backyard, and I felt something under my foot, and I looked, and I had stepped on a baby bird, and the mom was squawking around me, and then I realized why she was squawking around me is because I had stepped on a baby bird and killed it. But that became, and I started crying. I just had this overreaction to killing a bird. It reminded me of John Woolman, the famous Quaker, who also killed a bird. But it kind of became an epiphany for me that I was holding on to fear. I was not letting my kids, I was not letting them be who God created them to be, that I was just holding on to them so tightly. I was letting fear win. And it was kind of crushing them. And so if I wanted to let them become who God created them uniquely to be, I had to let go. And that was probably the most loving thing to do at that time, even though it was the most painful for me, which meant letting my son go to join the military, letting him go to boot camp. And I mean that more in the figurative sense at this point, because he was going to go, but I had to just release that.
Yeah, this is like an emotional letting go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I told my youngest son that he really needed to leave Newburgh if he was going to grow up and become a man, which was hard for me to do because I loved having him close. But helped him get a job out of state, and he left too. And so our nest was empty. And again, it was very hard to let them go. It was very hard to let go of that fear of the unknown. But at that point, I knew that loving them meant letting them leave. And that's hard because I had, they'd been in my home for 18 years at that point, 19 years, and I didn't want to let go.
Yeah. That really resonated with me, the idea, connecting with the Woolman's, a scholar, someone who's been really important to me, and kind of seeing that sense of, I think for Woolman in his journal, it's very much about his own seeking control too. For him, it's more control over nature, because he's like throwing like all this classic like little boy thing, right? He's throwing rocks at birds, and he kills some of the birds, or he knocks them out of the nest actually, and he realizes they're injured, and it's better to actually kill them than to move forward. So it's even more gruesome than your experience, I think, because it was intentional. But for that, it's about the control of nature, and here you kind of recognize that I think as a parent, there's like the boundary can blur very easily between the responsibility we feel for our children, and then the sense of like how that can move into like a need to control our children. That's probably just like the dark side of the responsibility we have as parents. And it's heavy stuff to work through. So I really appreciate you putting so much of yourself out there sort of in this book.
For sure.
How was that? I assume part of that was hard as you kind of have it now printed out and like it's out in the world. It's done in the sense that a book can be done. How are you feeling on the other side of this writing process, exploring some of these really hard things that were going on starting, around 2020, 2021, now that we're kind of nearing the end of 2023?
Yeah, so I should make clear that the hard stuff that I wrote about, I cleared with my sons so that they know that I've written about this. It was hard to write this. It was hard at first to talk about it. Like first few podcast interviews, I cried when I talked about my son going into the military, because it still can be really raw, especially when you think about what's going on in the Mediterranean.
Of course,
and my son was deployed last year in the Mediterranean, so that was always, it's right there in my mind. I think getting past the initial vulnerability hangover, I think it's become easier to talk about this, especially because other parents, other mentors have shared their stories with me. And that's one way I think that we become less alone, is by hearing that other people are also on this journey. So even this weekend, I was at a wedding shower for somebody, and another person talked to me about her son's journey and feeling like she couldn't talk to people about that just because it can be kind of embarrassing if your son or your daughter isn't doing what we expect young people to do. So being able to share my story, I think it opens up opportunities for others to share as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one story you shared with us in our pre-production meeting. I don't know if you're willing to share that story now, but I thought
Sure.
it was a great encapsulation of some of the still struggles, but also some of the humor that I think comes with parenting.
Yeah.
Would you mind kind of sharing one more story
Sure.
with us of that?
Sure. So I was in class, I had my computer open, and my youngest son tried to FaceTime me, and I just texted and said, I can't talk now because I'm in class. And he said, yo, I have some big news. And that brought up all this fear that I still have for him because I want him to be, I mean, he's doing really great right now, but I still worry about who he was and the struggles he had. So I was feeling all this fear, wondering if something had happened with his job or if he'd been in a car wreck, because he said he had big news. Mm-hmm. And so after class, I hurried back to my office and called him, and his big news was that he had bought a new video game. So my fear is still triggered, and I have to try to press that down. It's very difficult as a parent to do that. Like, we can automatically go to the really bad narratives because I think we love our kids so intensely. Mm-hmm. We worry about them, and it can be, we can just write these narratives in our head that aren't true at all. Mm-hmm. So he did get a talking to about, like, bro, this is your big news. Like, why are you bugging me in class to tell me this? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, maybe some of the joy of parenting and also the challenge that your children are a mirror to you, mm-hmm. right? Both in really delightful ways, but also in the challenging ways of like showing, seeing the way they can raise our anxieties or our fears, where they really don't need to be there.
Right.
And also in some ways that, again, like, I think we didn't talk about as much in this book, but you talk about some of the really wonderful moments with family you have. And, you talk about too in the book of having your two youngest sons are adopted. You have two older stepchildren. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the way you have a really beautiful scene, I think, where you're doing a gingerbread house competition in there, mm-hmm. and just some of the fun of that. And that's a really important note to sound as well, too, I think, in the midst of all this, because I think in some ways it's those moments of humor or surprise or fun that bring a really crucial levity to some of the harder things that parents are working through.
Absolutely. And a reminder that no matter what our permutations of family are, that we need to feel gratitude for those unique moments when
Absolutely.
We are together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Melanie, for writing this book and coming on the podcast to talk with us a little bit about what you learned in the process. I really enjoyed reading it.
Well, thank you, Jay. It's fun to see you grow from young adulthood into millennial-ness and being a great professor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This video podcast is a production of George Fox Digital. To find more material like this, you can subscribe to George Fox Talks on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Our team really appreciates your feedback in the form of likes, comments, and reviews, and we'd really love to hear what you think. To sign up for our weekly email list and to keep up to date with the latest episodes and publications, you can check us out on the web at georgefox.edu/talks. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.